Good afternoon. My name is Barbara Gressel, and I am a Deputy Commissioner with the Department of Business Affairs and Consumer Protection. I like to say at these workshops that I work for the best of all departments in the city. I get to help protect citizens, consumers, and also to help small businesses to become successful, and so it's exciting and fun. I'd also like to introduce a colleague of mine from the law department, Ray Phillips Santos. Ray and I have worked together with the mayor's policy team to help to implement the Chicago Paid Sick Leave Ordinance. And actually, that's really not the name of it. It's called the Minimum Wage and Paid Sick Leave Ordinance, Chapter 124 of the Municipal Code. And today I'm going to just go through the highlights and give you an opportunity to answer some questions, which is why I brought Ray along. So thank you in advance. Okay, so employers must begin complying with the ordinance on July 1st of this year. There is an exception for employees who are subject to a collective bargaining agreement that's in effect as of that date. Then the employee becomes covered under the ordinance beginning on the date that that collective bargaining agreement terminates. The ordinance does apply to all employers who maintain a business facility within the city of Chicago and or are subject to one or more of the city's license requirements. Now, this differs somewhat from the minimum wage portion of Chapter 124 because that ordinance has a minimum number of employees within the business before the minimum wage portion applies. But for paid sick leave, every size business must comply. So I want everybody to ooh and ah over the little cartoons that I managed to import. I tried to make it a little bit more exciting than just all text, so hope you appreciate the cartoons. Employees who work more than 80 hours in any 3-month period in the city qualify for paid sick leave. Employees also need to have worked at least 2 hours within the city within any 2-week period. And finally, those employees are qualified for paid sick leave whose employer maintains a business facility in the city or is subject to one or more of the city's license requirements. And I want to give you an example of a business that may not be located within the city, but would still be required to have a license. For example, a home repair contractor or a plumbing company or an electrical company, those companies who actually do business within the city are required to have a city business license. So even though they may be located in River Forest or Riverside or Evanston, they would still be required to obtain a city business license in order to have their employees perform work in the city. So those are the types of businesses that I'm referring to. Now, there are some examples of workers who are not covered by the ordinance. Those are employees who work less than 80 hours per calendar year within the city, government agencies such as federal workers or state of Illinois workers, and independent contractors who don't meet the definition of an employee under the state of Illinois labor law. And finally, the ordinance does not apply to participants in work experience programs. Let me also say that if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. I'll be happy to try to answer that, or we can also address questions at the end. One of the big we think advances of this ordinance is that domestic workers are covered by the ordinance. And the law does specifically describe what domestic workers are. It's a person whose primary duties include housekeeping, house cleaning, home management, nanny services, caregiving, personal care or home health services for elderly persons or persons with illnesses, injuries, or disabilities who require assistance, companion services, chauffeuring, and other household services to members of households or their guests in a private home or residence or any location where the domestic work is performed. So this is very broad, and it was intentionally written to be broad. And again, such domestic workers are covered by this city's ordinance. Okay, I like this picture too. So how does sick leave accrue? This is one of the questions that I've been asked a lot. So employees begin to accrue paid sick leave on July 1st of 2017 or on their first date of employment, whichever is later. Employees accrue sick leave at the rate of 1 paid hour for every 40 hours that are worked, up to a maximum of 40 hours of paid sick leave per calendar year, unless the employer sets a higher limit. So again, this ordinance sets a baseline, and employers can always grant more if they so desire. Paid sick leave accrues only in hourly increments, and employers must give employees up to 40 hours of paid sick leave every calendar year. Now, again, an employer may not want to use this accrual method. There are many employers who call us and say, well, I already grant sick leave, everybody gets X amount at the beginning of the year. Well, that's fine with us. Employers may certainly choose to front load their paid sick leave for employees instead of using the accrual method. And if paid sick leave is awarded immediately upon the date of eligibility, employees must be provided 40 hours within the first calendar year, and if the employer is subject to FMLA, which is the Federal Family Medical Leave Act, then those employees must be granted 60 hours for each subsequent year. Yes, sir.
This refers to the calendar year. That doesn't really mean January 1st to December 31st.
So
we front-loaded starting July.
That's fine. Then that's your calendar year.
Is there a way to change from the July 1st year to?
Why don't we wait until the end and we'll
Okay.
address that.
Thank you.
Okay? Excuse me, just a minute. Ray, are you writing these things down? Okay, good. See, that's why I brought him, to write these things down. Yes, ma'am.
Question. So the ordinance talks about the limitation. I know you're going to get into limitations on use, but it's relevant here for front loading. The ordinance talks about limiting use to 40 hours in a year unless there's an FMLA
Correct.
use, in which case you can add another 20 for a total of 60. The front loading talks about 60 in the second and subsequent years. What it is silent in the draft rules is whether that 60 that you front load can be used for any purpose during the year, thus increasing the ordinance's total limit, or whether that is intended to still be 40 regular sick leave hours plus 20 if you need the FMLA.
Okay. So this is a big question. Let me just say that those were the draft rules. And so the word draft means that they are going to be changed. So our draft rules were open for comment until Friday at the end of business day, and we've just started redrafting the rules. So those rules will clarify. Now, the question, I think, as I understand it, is, are the rules going to expand what the ordinance says? And the answer is no. So rules never can go further or give greater number of hours than the ordinance provides.
So can I assume then, and Ray can take this down to, because I did submit comments actually.
What's your name?
Kimberly Ross.
Okay.
On Friday, we emailed, so, will the rules, or can you have the rules clarify that the 60 hours of front loading still has that 40-20 split? So that it's clear that you don't, when you front load 60, you don't, it's not 60 for any purpose, but
Okay.
60.
The rules will clarify what the ordinance says, that employers are required to provide 40 hours of paid sick leave to their employees. Those employers who are subject to FMLA are required to provide up to 60 hours. Okay? We will make sure that the rules reflect that.
When are the final rules?
I can't answer that. We're reviewing them now. Okay? Before July 1st. Which doesn't give us much time.
No, that's a legitimate answer.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
How will we know when they're done? Will we just keep checking or?
Well, keep checking, but if Ray or I have received emails, we will be forwarding those to anyone on our friendship list, on our email list. Question over here? Okay, thank you. The next slide discusses carryover. At the end of a covered employee's 12-month accrual period, the employer, according to the ordinance, must allow the employee to carry over half of any unused accrued paid sick leave up to a maximum of 20 hours. An employer who grants 40 hours of paid sick leave at the beginning of the covered employee's 12-month period must allow the covered employee to carry over half of that into the next 12-month period. I think that's duplicated, isn't it? All right. If the employer grants 60 hours of paid sick leave at the beginning of the covered employee's 12-month period, then the employer is not required to carry over hours from one year to the next. So there are additional requirements for FMLA-covered employers. The Family Medical Leave Act applies only to certain employers, and these employers may be either a private sector employer, a public agency, or even a school. A private sector employer is covered by the FMLA if it employs 50 or more employees in 20 or more work weeks in the current or previous calendar year. Any covered employee who works for an employer subject to FMLA may carry over up to 40 hours of accrued and unused paid sick leave to be used exclusively for FMLA purposes, in addition to the maximum of 20 hours allowed for regular paid sick leave purposes. Now, that's what the ordinance says, but practically, remember that the maximum amount of time that an employee working for an FMLA covered business can use is 60 hours in a calendar year. A covered employee who works at least 80 hours for an employer within any 120-day period is eligible to use his or her paid sick leave on the 180th calendar day following the commencement of employment. And now we get into the subject of when paid sick leave may be used. So there are several parts of the ordinance. The first is how much paid sick leave accrues, how it accrues, and importantly, when may an employee actually use it. So obviously, sick leave may be used when a person is sick or injured for the purpose of receiving medical care or treatment. An employee may also use paid sick leave when a family member is ill or injured or needs to use to get medical care or treatment. And the Chicago ordinance also allows paid sick leave to be used if an employee or a family member is the victim of domestic violence or a sex offense. Paid sick leave may also be used when an employee's place of business is closed due to a public health emergency, or the employee needs to care for a child whose school or place of care has been closed due to a public health emergency. And importantly, an employer may not require that a covered employee find a replacement worker to cover their hours when the paid sick leave is used. Whoops. Okay, this is a picture of the notice. There are copies of that notice here. I think most people may have picked them up. They're also available for downloading on the city's website. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. So they have these reasons why they can call in sick and they can use their paid sick leave to take care of that, but where is our ability to question or ask for proof?
Okay.
Because, let's be real, they call off all the time, and then when you have to ask for proof, they aren't able to
Okay,
provide.
so one of the things that an employer can do is have a written policy that requires employees to provide notice to the employer whenever sick leave is foreseeable. For example, I have a doctor's appointment next Friday. I'm going to take time off for my doctor's appointment. Or my child has a doctor's appointment. So whenever sick leave
I'm
is...
not considering foreseeable, we already take care of that. I'm talking about last minute.
Okay, so you can have a policy that requires at 3 days or more, doctors or some sort of
Have to be a
proof.
3 days
3-day
or more, or
minimum.
more than 3 days. Your rules, the draft rules say more than 3 days, which is 4,
Right.
which is pretty much all of the whole year's rules.
Right. So we'll look that up. Ray's going to look that up for us while we're going. Yes.
My question is, if the leave is foreseeable, do we have the right to ask that they would, we run a daycare center, and so ratios are required by DCFS, and they're, it's a big deal. And if they're going to a doctor's appointment a week or two in advance, can we ask that they find a replacement?
No, the ordinance specifically states that you cannot require the employee to find a replacement worker.
Fire, or can we ask?
I am saying what the ordinance says.
You can require 7 days notice, though, for foreseeable leave. So then you'll have
And
7.
we have to find.
So then that's then on the administration to make sure we comply with the Department of Child and Family Services.
Correct.
Okay, and then as far as when this is in effect, teachers that call off the day of, that will also put us in risk of complying with keeping our center over with teacher to child ratios.
Right.
Okay, so then I guess my question would be, where do we get our support then?
Well, public schools have the same issue, that teachers call in all the time at the last minute. They have a bank of substitutes.
That they fund through the government, right? I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be difficult, I'm just.
Well,
trying to
you
realize
know what?
that.
I'm
just in fear that there's gonna be a morning that I don't have coverage that I need for 92 children.
It's just a group, and they have the daycare company.
Okay. Okay. Sir?
Must a family member of the employee live under the same roof as the employee?
No. Yes, ma'am?
I have 2 questions. First,
If, I don't know the answer to that.
The other question that I have, I'm sorry.
It would seem that if the employee isn't eligible, then they don't get that extra 20
Well,
hours. for the extra
that would
period.
be my logic
Yeah,
and
that's-
rationale, but the way the ordinance is written, it doesn't really spell it out.
And the rules don't clarify.
And the rules don't clarify, so.
Okay,
The other
thank you.
question that I have is, you use the term accrue. My understanding, and it may be wrong, is that if you do not stipulate when the benefit is accrued, earned, as opposed to just accrued, then it's presumed to be earned at the time it's accrued, which would then seem to me that it had to be paid out at, the time of termination, because you can't take the benefit away.
And how can it roll over if it has to be paid out?
There's no payout.
All right, well then, is it acceptable then, instead of referring to it as being accrued, as being accumulated, which is the legal advice we have been given with regard to looking at our paid sick pay that has existed prior to this ordinance, as a pay practice as opposed to a benefit?
You can use whatever term you'd like. The drafters of this ordinance use the word accrue,
Okay.
and that's the word.
Can your legal department give us
The legal department is the law department drafted it.
okay, can they give us some sort of answer on that? Because that's really quite important, because
Because you're technically, we would have to pay out at the end, but how can you pay out at the end if they have to be rolled over?
There's no payout. There is no payout.
When something's accrued, I think you have to.
Okay, well, we're getting into semantics, and actually,
We're just trying to make sure we are following it.
okay,
And also,
it's clear that there's no payout. The ordinance does not provide for payout.
the original question though was, can you require proof when the leave is 3 days or less?
So we're going to get to that at the end. Let me go through this, and we'll go through the ordinance and see what the ordinance says. Okay? So I have copies of the notice that needs to be posted on the table. It's also available on the department's website, which is still under construction, but you can get to the notice on BACP's opening page. Every employer must post the notice in a conspicuous place in the workplace. Every employer must provide the notice to all employees with the first paycheck after July 1st or when they are hired. The exception is that employers that don't maintain a business facility within the city or households that are work sites for domestic workers are exempt from the posting requirement. Sir?
Maybe kind of a silly question, but our next pay is on June 30th, which means the first in July would be the middle of July. Would it not comply with the ordinance if we give them the notice? on
Sure,
June
it would.
30th?
Absolutely, it would.
Can't imagine anyone-
No, that's okay, and that's a fine question. All right. So we do require that employers maintain records for covered employees for 5 years and make those records available for inspection upon request by our department. The name of the covered employees, the address, the occupation, social security number, hire date, the date this covered employee was eligible to use paid sick leave, the date and number of hours each covered employee used the paid sick leave, the rate of pay for each covered employee, the hours the covered employees work, the type of payment and wages to each covered employee, additions and deductions to each covered employee's wages, and dates of payment for each pay period. What are employees' rights under the ordinance? An employee who believes the employer has not granted the paid sick leave is entitled to may call 311 to report a violation, and a complaint form will be forwarded by my department and must be fully completed for the department to investigate. And I may as well tell you how the department does investigate. So initially, we'll look to see whether the business is covered by the ordinance, whether the business is located in Chicago and so forth. And then we generally reach out to the employer to discuss the complaint and to see if we can work things out. I will also tell you that the minimum wage ordinance is now 2 years old, and we've not yet cited a business for violations of the ordinance, despite many complaints that we've had. What we've done is we've reached out to those businesses, we've subpoenaed records from those businesses and reviewed those records, and in a number of many cases, we found that in fact the employee was not paid the proper wage, and to date we've recouped for employees in excess of $200,000 in back wages. But again, the goal has not been to cite or to find businesses to be in violation of the ordinance. Our goal is to make sure that businesses are complying with the ordinance. And so we do plan to treat the paid sick leave similarly. Our goal is to make sure that businesses understand the ordinance and comply with it. How can businesses comply with the paid sick leave portion of the ordinance? First, they must post a notice of the employee's rights under the ordinance in their business facility and distribute the notice to the employees. They must maintain records and make those records available to BACP. Employers may set a reasonable minimum for requested time off, not to be less than 4 hours per day. Employers may require notice before paid sick leave is taken for foreseeable uses or as soon as practicable on the day of the leave. Employers may require documentation for the use of paid sick leave if an employee is absent for more than 3 consecutive work days. And finally, employers may not discriminate or take adverse action against any employee in retaliation for exercising his or her rights. Okay?
So is this the point, because you just said employers may require documentation for use of paid sick days for an absence of more than 3 consecutive days. The question
That's
is, can they also ask for the DIT if it's less than 4
Okay.
days?
Well, what the ordinance says is more than 3 days. So the drafters of the ordinance,
We're asking if we put it in our policy, because currently in our policy as a business, we require that if you call off last minute, less than 4 hours prior to your shift, you have to prove that it's an emergency. And that's our internal policy. So we're asking, are you as the city forcing us to supersede our policy?
And it also, so the question is, we know what you can do. You can ask for it if it's more than 3 days. The question is, are you prohibited from asking it if it's
Ray,
3 or
why
less
don't you
days?
come up here?
Yes,
and-
sure. So as Barb said, the ordinance, and as I think you pointed out, the ordinance
You need to-
is the ordinance is silent as to that, and what we're trying to do with the rules is we are trying to fill in the gaps where the ordinance is silent, to make it as understandable as possible for you. I cannot promise, in fact, let me start that sentence again. I can promise that we will not fill in all the gaps. We will do our best to fill in all the gaps, but we won't fill in all the gaps. That is one where I think that, being as the ordinance is silent, if an employer wanted to say, anytime you take paid sick leave, I want to know why, as long as it doesn't conflict with the ordinance, that's doable. Now, there was a question earlier as to synchronization of benefit years, which I'm hoping that the draft that you saw had some explanation of. You may notice that we've taken pains to say that there is a work year, an employment year, a calendar year, a time when accrual begins. And all the words I just used mean when accrual begins. However, we've also put out there a benefit year. I can appreciate how if you have 100 employees and they all started on different days, you don't want to be keeping track of how the accrual for every single one of those. So the benefit year is the idea where you can say, all right, all of my employees are going to have a benefit year starting on July 1st or January 1st or May 15th or the Ides of March. Although the Ides of March is going to get kind of funny because that changes every couple of years. But to get everybody synchronized onto that year, you're going to have a gap from the beginning of employment to when everybody gets onto that year, which is why, and this is one of the areas that we've filled in, employees will start accruing, obviously, from the day after employment begins. They'll start accruing, and then all of those hours that they accrue, if you're using the accrual method, will carry over up to 20 hours. You can't have more than, you can never carry over more than 20 hours. But that way, once the benefit year starts, they, and let's say they get, pneumonia 3 days later, after the benefit year starts, they still can take paid sick leave, assuming that they've accrued it and they're eligible, et cetera. Does that answer your question?
Well, we're kind of planning to use the front-loading method. So how
The
would
front-loading
how would
method?
you synchronize in that situation?
Well, in that situation, so what happens, can you explain to me what happens between when they start employment and when the benefit year starts?
Well, I mean, we're trying to do this as simply as possible.
Sure.
So what our plan tentatively is that on July 1st, everybody gets 40 hours, let's say.
Right.
And then every July 1st after that, they get 60 hours if they've been, it's not their first year and so on.
Right.
I assume that would comply.
Absolutely.
And that brings up another question. We have accrued sick time under our current policy prior to July 1st. The ordinance doesn't care about that, right? All we have to show to comply is that on July 1st, people have 40 or whatever.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
But if we wanted to switch to, say, a calendar year, how would we do that? Can we prorate the 40 hours from July 1st to December 31st?
The ordinance is silent as to that, and I think as long as you're making a reasonable accommodation,
Nobody's losing anything.
right. We care about the spirit of the ordinance as much as the letter of the ordinance.
Fair enough, thank you.
I just have a quick question, and Barb, this is really for you.
Okay.
On the PowerPoint, on bullet 3, employees may set a reasonable minimum not to.
Employers.
Less than 4 hours. I think it mean not more than 4 hours. The minimum can't be more than 4. You can't require them to take a whole day. The third bullet.
Right.
Not to be more than instead of less than 4.
Means you can't make them take it in increments of 6 hours or
Right.
1 full
Yeah.
day.
Yeah, the increment can be 4.
If you're gonna take an hour, you gotta take actually 4.
Yeah.
You can what I say.
That's what it
You can't
But you
require
have to have a
them to
written
take
policy
6
that
or
requires
8,
that.
right?
Otherwise, the assumption is it's in 1 hour increments.
Does the draft have that right?
Yeah.
Or is that the one?
That's in, that's in the ordinance. It's in the ordinance and the regulations.
Right.
There it is. The ordinance says the employer may set a reasonable minimum increment requirement not to exceed 4 hours per day.
Exceed, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah,
And
you're right, it should be.
Say not to be more than,
Not more than.
not less than.
Okay.
That's exceed.
So it's like,
We have not to be less than 4 hours per day. Not-
But, okay. Okay.
could have 2 hours.
Oh, I see what you're saying. It's a typo.
Yeah, that's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Right.
I was just, and then when we read it, we thought that it said that 20 hours can be carried over for non-FMLA, but a total of 40 could be carried over to the following year for FMLA purposes. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Is it 20 plus 40 or?
Yeah,
40?
well, so this is one of the trickiest parts, one of the things that we have
That was the
talked
question I
about
posed.
more than any other thing, I think. So obviously, in 1 year, a covered employee cannot accrue more than 40 hours.
Right.
But you can carry over 60 when you add it, right?
Right.
Which is crazy. But these are the words that we're working with, and neither Barb nor I wrote this, but so
Thank God.
we are in the same position that you guys are in. We are interpreting the words that are on the page.
Can you go back?
So our interpretation of this is that it will take if somebody works for a company for if a person works for an employer for 3 years and never takes any paid sick leave, that person will have that 40 and 20 because they've accrued however 3 times what is that, 120? Okay. Hours, but they can only carry over 40 and 60.
40 and 20.
40 and 20, sorry, 40 and 20.
But they can't even use that, because according to the ordinance, they can use
Let them accrue 10,000 hours.
Right,
You
they can
still
only
use
use
40 or maybe 60.
60.
Because the
Correct.
The ordinance says that if, this is 124.045B, B6 says if an employer is subject to FMLA, the employee shall be allowed to carry over up to 40 exclusively for FMLA purposes, quote, in addition to the carryover allowed under section B5, which
Right.
is the one that says the 20.
Yep.
So that sounds like it's meant to be 20 plus 40 equals 60, but I don't, but in elsewhere, it really sounds like it's 20, and including the way you interpreted the rules, which is it's 20 or 40 if you need it for FMLA leave.
Right.
Correct.
And C1 also informs that discussion.
So the question that I posed to you in the email Friday, which I think is very important to have an answer to or to get clarification on, is if an employer, because we didn't get into this whole thing in the draft rules about the employee has to select at the end of the year, do they want to carry over half up to 20 regular use, or do they want to take the risk and carry over all of it up to 40 and not be able to use it for the opposite type of leave, the 40 for FMLA if they don't need FMLA? The question then is the employer still in compliance with the ordinance, even if not in compliance with that scheme and the rules, if they just simply say, employee, at the end of the year, you can carry over half up to 20, or if you end up needing an FMLA leave and had 40 left at the end of the year, you can carry over all of it. But so you'll for sure get your 20 or half up to 20, and if it so happens that you have an FMLA leave, which most people won't be able to anticipate at the end of the year, you just look back to see what the total was, and then you give it all to them up to 40. Is that still in compliance, even though it's not in compliance with the selection option?
So I'm not going to answer that directly because the selection requirement that is in your copy of the draft rules is not necessarily going to be in the final rules. And I'll have to leave it at that. You had a question. You can't answer?
I think it's related, so you may have the same response, but essentially trying to figure out in terms of carryover.
Could you turn that off, please?
In terms of carryover, you essentially have to track paid sick leave hours and FMLA hours separately into perpetuity, I suppose. So in year 2 and moving forward, let's say for example, in year 2 an employee didn't use any hours, they have 20 paid sick leave, and now they have 20 FMLA. From that point moving forward, you have to then track those hours separately every time you're doing an employee's carryover calculation.
Probably.
I think that that's fairly accurate. Yes.
And I'm sorry, just to verify, but it would then not be in compliance if, say for example, you just lump them in at the end of the year and redid that calculation.
I would, it's so hard to, we're doing our best to come up with these in a vacuum and give you the best advice as we can. Go ahead.
The ordinance is there to protect people, to protect your employees, to give employees who, for the most part, have never had the ability to take the day off when they're sick and get paid anyway, and or their kids are sick, or to take their kids to the doctor. Are there going to be people that abuse that? You bet. I know it. I'm a supervisor. I know it. It happens. The ordinance isn't perfect. It's not there to protect everybody. It is there to protect everybody, people who need it the most. So when we're talking about this FMLA leave, this regular leave, to me, what I remember, that the easiest way for me to remember this is if you're an FMLA qualified employer, then each employee can use up to 60 hours of paid sick time a year, if some of that is FMLA time. If you're not, then the most your employees can use is 40 hours. I think that's the best I can give you. Pat?
Hopefully an easier one. Can we just email employees and notice if they're direct deposit
Yes.
employees?
Yes. Ma'am?
I think I have two pretty simple questions.
I hope so.
Yeah, the first one is this ordinance, like, does it need to be tracked in addition to paid time off if we have paid time off in our policy, or is it
No.
Can it be rolled into?
So, as long as the amount of time off complies with the ordinance,
At least 40 hours.
correct, and as long as the reasons that time off can be used by the employee, then you can call it whatever you want.
Okay. So my second question is, we have a couple of seasonal employees that work like the bulk of their hours between July and August. And sometimes they come back and sometimes they don't, so, I mean, would we just have to like show that we kept track of those accruals, or, cause you said there's no payout, so we wouldn't have to pay it out at the end of the year.
Correct.
Like at the end of August or anything, but is it gonna be, like, we just need to have records that we've accrued for the 280 hours that they worked in those 2 months?
Is the question so that you can pay out in the next season?
No,
Or-
like, but it's saying that we would have to roll it over, so they work, let's see, they work July and August, we do our benefits on a calendar year, so we would have to roll over what they accrued in those 2 months come January 1st. And so that's just saying that we would have to let them take a paid sick day next July if they came back. But if they don't come back, it doesn't matter.
Well, if there's a break in service, Rule 3.10 speaks to
Okay.
that, which in draft form says, when a covered employee is separated from employment, so like a
Not
seasonal,
working.
right,
Uh-huh.
and rehired by the same employer. So the next season, they got rehired. Previously accrued unused paid sick leave shall be available for use and/or carryover by the covered employee only at the discretion of the employer.
Oh, okay.
And again, remember that they have to qualify to begin with. They'd have to work more than 80 hours within that 3 month, any 3 month time
Right,
period.
they're getting 280 hours in 2 months.
Okay.
But they also have to have worked at least 180 days, and those people might not have had, worked 180 days.
Before they can start using
Yeah,
it.
before they can start
Before
using
they
it.
use
We
For
have,
6
okay, so
weeks.
we have one part-time person that goes full-time over the summer and then is like once an 1 hour a week for the rest of the year, so that he would be covered.
Yep.
You can classify your part-time employees differently in terms of the eligibility for paid sick leave. You can give regular employees all paid time off on the first day and part-time employees have to wait 180 days.
Tanya?
I just want to clarify her first question regarding, if you have a PTO policy. You said that if it's in the same amount, meaning at least 40 hours, or at least 60 hours, if it's a semi-employer, and the reasons for using the time, I think you cover those two categories that you could. So what about everything else that's in the ordinance? When it starts, all of the other sort of restrictions in the ordinance, what if your policy doesn't align with that? Is it just those two issues, or is it everything?
No, it's,
Well, I mean, yes, we've summarized it as you stated in the general and 3.01, but certainly the requirements that, you have to be able to use it within 6 months of starting, within 180 days, that's certainly a requirement that that needs to be followed.
The 4-hour time periods, I mean, all of the other sort of restrictions that are.
Yes.
Okay, you have to comply with
yes.
all of those things.
But the
even if current
right,
PTO
but the
policy.
biggest, I think the biggest must follows are the amount and how it can be used. But you're correct. There are other issues as well that must be complied with. Ma'am?
I guess my question is in a similar vein. We have part-time hourly and then we have regular salary, part-time and full-time employees. Part-time hourlies are the only ones currently not getting any form of sick pay. Our regular employees get a very generous allocation of 10 paid sick days a year, which they can use, and if they overuse, obviously we deduct them. Now, and it's not accrued, it's given and it's treated as a pay practice. We far exceed anything that's being done for that class of employee and what the requirements are. So therefore, are we safe in saying we don't need to deal with them? We just simply need to deal with our part-time hourly?
So what you're saying is you have paid sick leave in the amount of 10 days that they can use, that you front load,
Right.
and they can use in whatever manner they wish.
Right.
Then you're meeting the
Well,
requirements.
Actually, let me take, I think it's front loaded, yes. The vacation is accrued and then earned. But the other question I would have is, okay, I can give this notice out to everybody in the workplace, but all that's going to do is completely confuse the regular employees who already get 10 paid sick days. Am I required to hand out this notice to everyone? Obviously, posting it won't bother people. You follow, it's going to be kind of oxymoronic.
That's your option.
Yeah. So, if it's, I'm going to tell you that I think if it doesn't apply to your salaried employees, then why would you give it to them?
Well, that was my reaction.
Yeah,
but then-
I'd say that's common sense, but I understand that people think that common sense and government regulations don't often follow one another.
We're so uncommon, it wouldn't be called common.
Yes, there you go. I like that. I'm going to use that.
Actually, somebody wiser than I came up with it.
You didn't have to say that part.
So can I just clarify something on what she's talking about? So if you're giving them the 10 days, you don't have to give more, but you have to be clear that you're not requiring certain things that aren't required in the ordinance, like things we've been talking about today, like if normally you require them to find a substitute, or normally you require a lot of notice, or I know a lot of employers with paid time off policies will, give like a little check mark or a demerit if you don't give enough notice, or even if you use it, and none of that can apply. So I don't know if in your situation so it's not just the number of days, but you have to follow law.
It's how it's being administered, I think, is important too. That's correct. Sir?
Assuming we give more than is necessary, more hours than required under the ordinance to one class of employees, say people work 40 hours or more a week, as long as we give the minimum amount required to another class of employees, we're still in compliance with the ordinance, correct?
Correct. And again, I want to repeat that it's not, and I think it's important, it bears repeating, it isn't just the hours that's important, it's how they can be used, no retaliation,
Yeah,
you don't
somebody
have
can
to,
apply otherwise.
right, exactly. Ma'am?
I know because we've had this question before that there will be an argument about payout if somebody is dismissed because these are called accrued days. We have had employees, in the past, ours were earned, not accrued, they weren't paid out, but we've had discussions about that, and so I worry about how we will,
Isn't it in the ordinance? Okay.
you know, if somebody's laid off or let go, I have a feeling that they're gonna argue with
If you keep
the
them
term.
separate, if you keep the sick days and every other kind of personal leave you have, you won't have to pay out the sick days. But if you have an overall PTO policy where it's all lumped in together, you'll have to pay it all out.
Yeah, because you have to pay out like vacation days.
Yeah, and if you
So
lump
you don't
vacation
make a
personal leave,
distinction and you have to pay them out, but sick days you do not have to pay out.
doesn't matter if you call it accrued or earned or accumulated or anything, if you keep it in a separate pot.
And we purposely did that so you wouldn't, employers wouldn't have to pay that each year. And the other thing I just wanna mention, in terms of this front loading and what kind of benefit you can use, you know, you can do what you want, but the point is, people, workers have to get whatever's in the, at least the minimum that's allowed, that's they're entitled to in the law. So you just can't give them less, and they have to be able to, you know, can't give them less than the 40 hours and what you can get under FMLA, and also when they can take the time off. You know, you can't keep like changing the benefit year and then all of a sudden they can't take it when they would have been able to under the ordinance. We have to follow the ordinance. But if you're front loading and doing more, that's great. I mean, my employer is actually.
So under 045A3, it does say, unless an applicable collective bargaining agreement provides otherwise, upon a covered employee's termination, resignation, retirement, or other separation from employment, his or her employer is not required to provide financial or other reimbursement for unused paid sick leave.
I guess I'm just looking at
Yeah.
Just but because it's not
Put
on
that
the
on the
sheet.
sheet. You mean, we have to give to the
Yeah,
person
I
that's
noticed
going to
the
be
employees,
arguing.
I don't know.
Yeah, but
a lot.
Yes.
the federal law says if you earn the benefit, you can't take it away.
But it's not a benefit.
Are you saying it's a pay practice and then, you know, that I would love to get clarification on that.
This is now the law, it's not all
Ma'am?
I just had a question in regards to the definition of a family member. I think I saw somewhere it was defined. It said, you know, mother, brother, spouse, domestic.
Including
partner.
but not limited to.
unless- Yeah, of course we get those like with cousins. So it would be okay if a cousin lived in the household and they're in your household, I mean.
The ordinance is quite liberal.
I know, that's what I was looking at. Yeah.
It's even people who like the family. It's exactly.
So Ray's going to read to you what the ordinance defines as family member.
Family member means a covered employee's child, legal guardian or ward, spouse under the laws of any state, domestic partner, parent, spouse or domestic partner's parent, sibling, grandparent, grandchild, or any other individual related by blood or whose close association with the employee is the equivalent of a family relationship.
I know, so you can use it.
Do you want me to go on?
Stop.
Okay, all right. Since people are trying to hear this wherever that's going,
Well, the bullet point number 4, this was brought up already. Would it be contradictory deeper to the requirements, if an employer requested that documentation was provided for any amount of sick time off, and not required for 4 days or more.
The fiscal one.
Was it, yeah, fifth, sorry. For the requirement for documentation,
Right, so if somebody calls off for 1 day.
if they
we
request,
require them.
if a company has a policy where they request documentation, would that,
You already gonna fire her if they don't give it to you?
I just can't.
Right,
I
like-
just- And obviously they're not required to, so
Right.
it would have to be outside of that.
Yeah, this is one of those gray areas where
Gray area.
you use your best judgment.
In your final rules, are you going to impose a statute of limitations as opposed to the city having the discretion to not look at things that are 3 or more years old?
No. Next question?
So somebody could bring a claim 10, 20, 30 years later, even though you don't have to keep records by state law longer than 3 years, by apparently city ordinance by 5 years, or by the rules, 5 years.
I will repeat, we are not going to put a statute of limitations in the rules at this time. If the final rules come out and there's a statute of limitations there, then there's a statute of limitations there.
I'm sorry, if what comes up?
If the rules come out and there's a statute of limitations there, then you'll see that there's a statute of limitations. But at this point, I'm not going to comment further on that. Other questions? Yes.
I just have a question regarding, so if we already have, like PTO for our full-time hourly employees, as a benefit, and then we have to give the sick leave to our part-time, but we want to still keep the full-time benefit a little bit, more attractive. If we were to add on sick leave because we are giving the paid time off and that equals to what this ordinance is, can the actual sick leave itself be less days because the PTO is meeting these requirements? Where we only give them a couple of sick days on top of the PTO that they're getting that's meeting this? Or does the sick leave have to match this and the PTO has to be, does that make sense?
So I'm going to answer that because it would be my department that would be investigating it. And
Okay.
what I would be looking at is whether an employee has at least the minimum of time, whatever you call it. You can call it whatever you want. And I would just be looking to see whether an employee has the ability to take time off, take sick time. I don't care what you call it.
Okay.
And it would be my group that's looking at this,
Okay.
so,
Okay.
yeah. Any other questions?
Just a quick
Yes.
comment. So obviously I work with both of you, and I think I find you all to be very fair. I think a lot of the employers in the room, and I'll speak for myself in particular, the folks that I represent, are less concerned about what the city is going to do and more concerned about being sued. Because there are trouble damages, which you guys don't have anything to do with, in the ordinance. And so to the extent that your two offices can be very clear on, in the rules, on what it is that we're supposed to follow, it helps us in the event that we are sued, instead of someone coming to get their grievances addressed in the city.
It's been an interesting experience for me rolling out and enforcing the minimum wage ordinance and then having the opportunity to do the same with this. And I had a lot of concerns about what we would see. And we worked very closely with the Illinois Department of Labor and the Federal Labor Department also with their investigators and their attorneys in rolling out the minimum wage ordinance and listening to their experiences. So what I've found since we started investigating is that I'm not aware of what goes on in private litigation, first of all, but I've found some employers that I think just didn't know and that have come into compliance quickly. I've found very few that were really trying to take advantage of people. I can think of 2 businesses that were really trying to take advantage of people. And actually, we'll be bringing our first enforcement under the minimum wage ordinance very shortly based on that. And again, you know, in this department, we're kind of a yin and yang department, you know, consumer protection and business support, and I don't see big bad employers out there. I see employers like I see sitting in front of us today, people who wonder how they're going to comply with the ordinance and still be, you know, financially secure. And I want you to succeed. I want businesses to be successful. But I also want to protect, people who are least able to protect themselves. And I hope you'll join me in that work, in this fight. It's not a perfect ordinance. We've certainly struggled. Ray and I have struggled mightily to be clear in our rules. We've tried for our rules to be very simple and easy to follow. And like Ray said, we know there are gaps. Well, let me just say this, that we're going to come out probably by the end of next week with the rules, but that we can amend them going forward. And, you know, we want feedback. We want feedback from businesses. We want feedback from advocates. We want to know how we can make this work the best we can. And, you know, the city has taken on a big responsibility to help protect our citizens who are least able to protect themselves. And so, again, we're not walking around with a baseball bat on July 2nd looking for bad employers. We're going to help as much as we can. We're going to help you to follow the law as best we can. Yes?
Will you be, or either somebody be available to answer questions if we have?
You can certainly email us, and Ray and I will try Ray's leaving. We will try our very best to answer you. Let me just say this. First of all, we're both lawyers. We cannot give legal advice. Okay, we cannot do that. Our client is the city of Chicago. We can give you the rules when we get those done. We can give you copies of the ordinance. We can show you what part of the ordinance applies. We can even talk to the Cook County and help you meet their requirements as well. We'll do our best. I do have cards up here. I know I'm in contact with a number of you that are here. Feel free to email us and we'll do our very best to answer you.
But we cannot review your PTO or PSL and say, you know what, yeah, this is fine. Not doing it.
No long hypotheticals?
So,
This is more of a comment, not a question, because I don't need it answered now, but I think it's something to address in your rules. I cannot remember if I put it in my email last week. The ordinance talks about one unique exception to not having to comply with paid sick leave rules for the construction industry if there's a bona fide agreement, as opposed to a bona fide collective bargaining agreement, as opposed to all other industries where if there's a collective bargaining agreement, you can waive the rights in that. But the ordinance actually totally exempts any construction industry collective bargaining agreement, regardless of whether it speaks to paid sick leave. Your rules were silent on it, and I think that's going to lead to confusion as to whether the ordinance still applies. And I know you said, of course, the ordinance is always going to be the final word on it, but maybe you could address in your final rules whether, the issue with that one industry's collective bargaining agreement.
It's a comment, it's not a question.
Okay.
Okay, well, we thank you for your patience in this process. We thank you for your comments.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you, guys.
And we do have, I did leave my cards up here.
And as you exit, if you should please put the surveys on the table by the door.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Actually,
you.
that's what we're doing. We work for Legan and so what happens is that we have a location